Welcome back to Area DMG. I'm your host, Opasida, Mile High Mouth, and today let's talk a little bit about, well, the Nintendo Switch, or rather the next Nintendo system. Now, there's a lot of rumors out there where like, oh, it's the Nintendo Focus, and then there's stuff where they're like, it's backwards compatible, it's a portable, it's a hybrid again, and I'm like, okay. Now, they've been mentioning all sorts of rumors about it, like PS5 quality graphics, some type of weird new control scheme, cameras, all sorts of speculation and such. And you know what? I want to talk realistically about the Nintendo Switch successor and backwards compatibility. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the precedent that Nintendo has set with previous backwards compatibility and where I think we're going to go with the Nintendo Switch successor. Now, to me, would it bother me if the next Nintendo system were a portable, were a hybrid system, portable and then also available to play on the TV, and it wasn't compatible with the Nintendo Switch? Well, to be perfectly honest, I would be a little sad at first, but I think I'd be okay. I mean, the reason why most people want game compatibility between the Nintendo Switch and whatever its successor would be is because there are some of us who own a lot of stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of us who own a lot of stuff. And, we own a lot of physical stuff. There's some of us who do that, There are collectors who own a lot of physical games. I mean, do you think I care if it's physically backwards compatible with the Nintendo Switch? Yeah, I kind of do. I would really like it to. If it's not, that's not an issue. But if it is, that's much better. I would prefer that they handle backwards compatibility in, for example, I expect most of the accessories for the Nintendo Switch to be compatible with the new system. For example, I don't care if Joy-Cons are compatible, but that Pro controller, and then the special edition controllers, like the NES controller, the Super NES controller, the Sega Genesis controller, the N64 controllers for Nintendo Switch Online, I would hope that those are compatible with the new system. And I expect third-party controllers, especially ones from 8BitDo, to get updates to make them compatible with whatever new system. We'll see updates on that. I'd like the physical backwards compatibility, but I think I know what they're going to do with it in regards to the next system. If the next system launches with backwards compatibility, it's going to be a little bit similar to what they did in the past. Let's take a look at what they did in the past. Okay, so first of all, when it comes to Game Boy, handhelds, you have the Game Boy, you have distinct lines of those. The Game Boy, the Nintendo handheld family, which once they announce a new system, I've been putting off making that Nintendo handheld family video because I know that as soon as they do it, they're going to announce the next system. So I've been waiting and playing a game of chicken, essentially, waiting for them to announce the next system. So, going back to it, there's a distinct line of Game Boy, Nintendo DS, 3DS, Switch, and other types of systems. You have the Game & Watch games, which are just closed systems. You do have a little handhelds like the Virtual Boy or the Pokemon Pocket, which are have their own little cartridge systems but aren't connected to the other ones. But yeah, let's take a look at it. You have the first ones in their system life, in their handheld family. They had the Game Boy, right? Now you have Game Boy games. Game Boy games work on the Game Boy Color, and then you had Game Boy Color and Game Boy games. This will work on the Game Boy and on the Game Boy Color. You had also some that had Super Game Boy compatibility, but that's something else. Then you had Game Boy Color only titles, and then you had Game Boy Advance titles. The way it was set up, when you got a Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Advance SP, both versions of the SP, all were compatible with the previous things. When they put out the Game Boy Micro, they dropped Game Boy compatibility with the Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Color Dual things. So the way they had it is, once they got to a newer standard, they just kind of they had a chipset inside the Game Boy Advance that allowed it to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. When they got to the Game Boy Advance, to the Game Boy Micro and the Nintendo DS, they dropped that line. They made those not compatible, and you just had a system that didn't use these, but did use these. You could use the Game Boy Advance and then the Nintendo DS. Now, a little further on, when they got to the DSi, they had dual mode DSi games, which would work on the DSi and were region locked, and then would also work on the DS, but have enhanced features on the DSi. And then they also released DSi only games. Now, the cool thing about these is, like, well, when they moved to the Nintendo DS, like the DSi, they dropped compatibility with the Game Boy Advance. So they went into it a little bit and then dropped those. Then they came out with the Nintendo 3DS. The 3DS cartridges were, or game cards were, had a little notch there to prevent you from putting them into the DS or DSi. But even if you chop that off, like I did in a video, go look it up, they would not be able to be read by the previous system. Mainly because when they put out the 3DS, they made it. They left in enough stuff here so they could make it compatible, so it could read these previous systems. And then they put out Nintendo new 3DS only stuff, like say Xenoblade. Now, around this time there was the Nintendo 3DS and the Wii U, and then they launched the Nintendo Switch. When they launched the Nintendo Switch, of course Nintendo Switch games don't work with the 3DS line, and 3DS games don't work with the Nintendo Switch. In fact, the switch between, yeah, I know, that's a terrible pun. The switch to eventually killing off the Nintendo 3DS line dropped compatibility for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of systems, and like all these types of things don't work on the Switch, right? Well, we do have these available, some of these available as digital things now, and that's one way of backwards compatibility with older systems, but it's not physical compatibility. I think the next Nintendo successor, the successor to the Switch, may have a new kind of cartridge format, because that's what we're hearing, but the new game card format will be different. It won't fit in the Nintendo Switch, and it'll have either a second slot or just a slightly different thing. I don't think they're going to go the same route that they did with the Nintendo 3DS, where they had like the little notch. What I think they're going to do is a completely different style of cartridge that's going to be slightly larger, and just slightly larger. And then there's going to be, similar to like the Game.com, or similar to the Nintendo DS, there'll be an option 2 thing where you could have a Nintendo Focus, or whatever they want to call it, or the Nintendo Switch 3D, whatever they want to call it, game card slot, and then a slot specifically that lets you read Nintendo Switch games. It'll be backwards compatible physically in its first iteration, and then down the way they'll drop that, and it'll just be their game cards for that, and then digital compatibility for older Nintendo Switch games. Which I think that's what they're going to do. I feel that we're going to get, like, whatever the next Nintendo system is going to be, will have a second slot for the Nintendo Switch. And it's gonna, the first iterations, you're gonna have a smaller one, that that has the 2 slots, and a normal one that has the 2 slots, and then you're going to eventually, a little ways down, have a slight upgrade to those that drops the option 2 slot, meaning that if they put out a new system with a new type of game card, it's going to be I think it's going to be backwards compatible with the Nintendo Switch until like 2026 or 7, meaning that you're going to have it be backwards compatible until they can drop the backwards compatibility physically. In other words, they'll just drop the secondary slot, and you'll just be like, if you own something digitally, it'll work on the new system, but if you own it physically, they'll have dropped that. Similar to like what Sony also does, where the first versions of the PS3, for example, could read like I think it was the first version of PS4 could read like PS1, 2, 3, and 3 or something like that, if I remember correctly. And then they just dropped the compatibility for that. Kind of similar to how I see that they're eventually going to drop backwards compatibility with PS4 discs in the future. Nintendo will be a little similar to Sony in that regard. They're not going to be like Microsoft, where Microsoft's like, oh, you have a Series X. You want to put in an original Xbox game into it? Now you own that Xbox game on your Series X. It's super weird. But that one also has some limits. And it's limited because like it has to have like a digital version that's available. So when they close down that Xbox store and the Xbox 360 stores in the future, that backwards compatibility may be subject to change. I think what we're going to have is whatever the next system will be, NSO, like the Game Boy, NES, Super NES, Sega Genesis, N64, Game Boy Advance stuff will carry over, and many of your digital stuff will need a small upgrade or some type of patch, but it should work. Like a lot of these games nowadays are on the same engines, and those engines scale up. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with that. But as for physical compatibility, I think if they do backwards compatibility for the next Nintendo system, the first couple iterations of it will have backwards compatibility with the Nintendo Switch. And then later iterations of it will just drop that physical backwards compatibility. And you know what? I feel like that's fair. Honestly, a lot of Nintendo stuff, especially like the physical things, I have a ton of different ways to play Game Boy games. There's even new systems like the Analog Pocket or some of those little system on a chip things where I can still play these games. And people have discovered that, like with some of these systems, there's all, like for example the Game Boy, original Game Boy hardware, people buy that and mod that all the time. The aftermarket for Nintendo handhelds is fantastic. And if you're a fan of, like, say, the Nintendo new 3DS and all that, or the 3DS, there are some ways in which you can fully take advantage of that. Most of the stuff there, like a lot of the stuff that was on the Nintendo eShop, there are people who are working on rescuing that. And then, of course, there's always a chance that Nintendo might port over some of their games that were on the 3DS to future systems. So, I like backwards compatibility, but I'm okay if they, like, drop it for the next system. But I'd like it if they stagger that dropout, similar to what they did with previous devices. So let me know in the comments below what you think. And until the next video comes out, you are now caught up. Morning, Maya.